Okay, so now we're at the main event of talking about this unlikely situation of how do you learn cybersecurity? How do you learn any principles that are practical at all from things like 3D modeling with Blender or modding video games? The two video games that come to mind are Darkest Dungeon and XCOM 2 War of the Chosen. Those are the two things that I've modded a lot of files for. And a lot of it was just like game balance stuff for Darkest Dungeon. And there's some stuff that's for like alternate art to like give different costumes to the soldiers, to the units that you have, like changing up how the stats work so that it gives a different gameplay experience. And it's like, oh, Darkest Dungeon is really hard or whatever, but you can have like a whole bunch of mods and like a bunch of different classes where they're not super balanced and everything. I want to tweak the balance in so that things work a little bit differently, so that instead of focusing on one thing or another, instead of relying a whole lot on dodging, for example, making protection a more important thing where you're going to be more likely to get hit, but there's going to be damage mitigation that goes against that. And that also led into a greater importance on healing status ailments instead of just like chewing through, relying a whole bunch of on dodge and then just like chewing through health and stuff. So it gave a different gameplay experience. That was something where like I played the game, I realized, it would be cool if I made these changes to it. I wonder how it would feel, how it would play out if instead of focusing on this, we focused on that. What are the files that I have to manipulate? What are the variables that are controlling this or that? And then going through and making those adjustments, going back and doing a couple of rounds of gameplay with it, and also thinking, this is really good, but what are some, other effects that might be down the road? Like, I don't know, if protection is one thing that you're expecting to get hit more often than something that would usually be an attack that's like very unlikely to hit, but does a ridiculous amount of damage, and that's kind of game breaking, or it could be, then that whole protection mechanic might not work so well there. And then I might want to go into the settings and adjust that enemy character's stats to either lower the damage output and increase the likelihood of hit. So here, that's the whole thing. That I'm explaining that there are a lot of variables to consider, and that when you have familiarity with the system, in this case, you have familiarity with how the game works, then you are able to consider these different factors and then manipulate them in order to create a desired result. In this case, in order to create a desired gameplay experience that deviates significantly from the main gameplay because you are manipulating variables. And that's the whole thing. It is hacking in a way. That's in the broad sense of the term, of just messing around and changing the behavior of a system. In that sense, absolutely, like pretty much all modding, you are hacking the game. The super obvious thing is like, oh, instead of having the super basic enemies drop 10 gold, now I can make them drop 1,000,000. Yeah, that's like super simple, straightforward hacking. I make the rusty dagger that you start out with, instead of it doing 1 damage, I can make it do 99 damage. It's like, sure, if you find where those variables are stored for the damage of rusty dagger, being spurgy about it, there is like a whole set of JSON information that controls the equipment stats in Darkest Dungeon. So there's things like that where even if I like try to give a general example, then I think, oh wait, there actually is something that's specific towards that within this context that I'm familiar with. Once I am like on a team that has some kind of, what are they called? I can't think of the proper terms for it. There's like systems that collect a whole bunch of information and centralize possible like security risks. General term is an RMF, but that's not what I was trying to think of. So risk management framework is like one of these. So once I become familiar with a defensive framework, then a lot of things would be secondhand. And that's something where people who like play video games, they're not doing anything productive. Well, they are gaining familiarity with that system or whatever, but like they know how the gameplay mechanics work and they get an understanding for it, which famously or infamously, depending on how you look at it, a lot of games journalists these days like really suck because they don't put in the time to like really appreciate the game, or they don't have those soft skills for how do you approach the series of problems presented within a video game in order to fully appreciate the experience. And then you go a step further with hacking the experience and customizing it when you're modding video games. Perhaps it's not a stretch at all to say that video game modding is very directly related to hacking. Just to talk about XCOM 2 for a second, the simple thing that came to mind of a game balance thing was for Molotov cocktails. So you have different grenades, and there's different, effects that the different grenades do, where I wanted to have the Molotov cocktails have a larger area of effect because they have like no damage. It just sets them on fire and does like 1 to 3 damage, which is super small, instead of 3 to 4, which is the base damage for the grenades. Having these things in the back of your mind gives you a sense of comparison for how game breaking it is to do one thing or another. And like I looked up in the documentation, looking up on forums and things of what are the variables for the radius of the grenade effects, and I was able to find which configuration files I have to manipulate to increase the radius by 1. And then I see how that plays out, where things worked out, tested through it, and I see how it affects the gameplay. So making a change that you expect a certain kind of behavior, and then confirming that that behavior is implemented within the program that's running, in this case within a video game. It's absolutely hacking the experience. Hacking isn't always about making something like ridiculously out of balance or whatever. I would say the majority of hacking in video game communities, hacking, big air quotes around that, the majority of modding in video game communities is just about making a better customized game experience. When you're just like doing it locally to your copy of a game, then it's like not, you're not messing up live servers that are damaging other people's experience. So then we even have that principle of sandboxing, where and also having save states where it's like I like all these configurations that are here. I'm going to document somehow the different mods that I have active for this campaign that I have set up, but I want to experiment with another campaign later. I want to experiment with turning off some mods and turning on others. Well, it's important to document what worked so that I have a baseline, so that I see, there's a conflict with things aren't rendering correctly, or there are glitches that are caused where the game is hanging whenever this particular skill is used. It's like, then I might be able to pinpoint what was changed so that I could see what was causing a problem where there was no problem before. So even certain coding practices and backup management practices could be implemented, or you are implementing them when you get hands-on experience of like why this is important. That's why I would say it's a soft technical skill, because it's not directly a skill that relates to managing a risk management framework, because it's a different program. I'm doing a video game. I'm not managing a network, but it's the soft skill there of some of these principles of like managing save states properly before trying to change configurations to see if something new would work. So the next big topic is, how does Blender, which is a 3D modeling program, how does that relate to cybersecurity? Surely make some art program that can't relate to cybersecurity in any way, shape, or form. No, here, let me tell you why this is relevant on my resume. So Blender is a framework that it is all just ones and zeros at the end of the day. It is just a program that has a very detailed graphical user interface, and it is all about making a graphical representation of something within 3D modeling. But at the end of the day, it is all just code, and this is just very, very advanced graphical focus that's going on here. So it's like the opposite of doing the command line, you could say. But it is a framework for manipulating data. And you have to understand Blender is more like a toolkit for manipulating data that ultimately renders a 3D representation of a model. There's stuff that you can do with it, figure it out. So there's the aspect of self-learning of, how I want to make this happen. I want to make a flower, but I want to add blend shapes to it so that I can animate the flower blooming. So I'd change the X and Y coordinates of the petals and probably use an array modifier to have it symmetrically move around, and then have, one blend shape being the basis, and then another for being a closed bud, and then another one for being open. And I made that off the top of my head. Even talking through a hypothetical, after you have enough experience with something, you immediately get a sense of, I want to do this. Here is a tool within the toolkit that might help me achieve that goal. And when you talk this kind of thing out, then there might be other tools that are suggested. You could debate over like which one is better and why, and then you would be able to solve some problems that you'd encounter from like, I didn't see that using this modifier might cause these problems. Regardless, the thing about Blender is, so it's a big toolkit where you have to learn, how do I do these manipulations? Like something that I made fairly recently was just a coat for a 3D model character. It's just a military style coat. But because it's symmetrical, everything has to be mirrored from one side to another. And so I had to look up, how do I manage a mirror modifier, basically? I do the model on one side, on the left side, and it's copied over to the right side. This relates to cybersecurity because when you are dealing with any kind of program that is very intricate, it can be really overwhelming with all the processes that you could possibly encounter and could go through. But when you just go through the motions, when you just just try it out, buddy, then you get a sense of comfortableness with starting out with a huge toolkit where it's like, I don't even know where to begin with this. Trying some things that you have objectives in mind. I want to make a coat. I should look up how to do this. Oh, I keep running into this problem where I change something on the left, but I need it to change on the right exactly the same. Oh, the standard practice for how you do this is you just make one side of it and then you flip it over the axis so that it's mirrored, so that you always have symmetry for that, and then you only like activate that. You only, apply that modifier after all the changes are done. And if you want to make more changes, then you delete half of the model and then you reapply the modifier, and then you make the changes as you wish, and then you'll have that copied over while being the same on the left and right side. There's a lot of just details of reading through documentation, researching things for specific problems that you encounter that mirrors that soft technical skill of identifying a regular problem and figuring out the regular solution for it. So with weight painting, this is something with animation to make the vertices move along a bone. It's kind of hard to explain. The amount of movement for different parts of the mesh is determined by the weight that's assigned to those vertices on whatever bone they're associated with. So then this allows an arm to bend. It's notoriously difficult. There's notoriously crap in Blender to that you can only paint on on one face at a time. You can't paint through an object. So if I have my character, for example, had the weight painting was completely wrong for the chest bone. So there's different bones for the spine, but for the chest, I needed it to have all the weight painting there, and I'd have to do the front and the back each on its own instead of doing it symmetrically, and that's kind of hard to do because I can't see the front and the back at the same time. Another thing is there's also the XY symmetry there that I had to look up how to apply it. And there was a specific setting on a specific tool that allows you to project the brush through the model that you can paint both sides at the same time. Then you have to be cautious about how you have your viewport angled, because you might hit odd vertices that you're not trying to paint if you have a weird angle that you might I caught part of the cuff at the same time as the chest. So when I was testing it out, I have the character walking forward, and then all of a sudden there's the cuff link on one side just spaghettifies. It stretches out a whole lot, and that's because the weight was incorrect. It's messing up the XY coordinates for where the weights for those vertices are assigned, so it goes all over the place and looks weird. But I was able to identify what was going wrong with that, and I was able to track it back for, oh yeah, this is a weight painting issue that's affecting the animation. I need to check what's going on with that cuff link and where is it getting assigned different weights from different bones. So again, soft technical skill of being able to identify, being able to diagnose problems, identify the root of the problem, go back and systematically go through things in a meaningful way and adjust them. My relation of this to cybersecurity stuff is more generalized. You have a framework that you're doing. I am keeping it in general terms because I don't know all the specifics. I'm not in charge of a risk management framework, and if I were, then there probably would be security risks of explaining the internal workings of how one thing or another functions. Let me think about generalities of networking stuff. Let's say is it DNS resolution? No. It's managing ARP tables. So it's not DNS, it's address resolution protocol, ARP. And this is just vaguely what ARP does, is it associates an IP address. So for your router, will associate an IP address to a MAC address. And that's not MAC like Apple. That's a media access card, I think. There's a few things that are MAC. It's the physical address of your device. I forget the details in that, but I could easily look it up. How you can spoof MAC addresses as well to get around a router that has your MAC block. Because if I'm on a wireless network that's at Starbucks or something, and let's say that they have a real technical guy that's at Starbucks, and you realize, oh, this guy, he's listening to music for 3 hours while just ordering one coffee. We're going to ban this IP. You wouldn't ban the IP address, you'd ban the MAC address. There is a way to spoof that so that I appear as if I have a different MAC. I'm not too sure about the tools for that, but I'm almost certain that you can just do it from the basic command line. Here's odd speculation or whatever. This is my toolkit. It's like with Blender, where there's all the different drop downs where I have to understand there's certain things that are appropriate for manipulating faces as opposed to manipulating vertices and the different modifiers to apply. Okay, there's a whole different toolkit that I'm dealing with when I'm talking about network security, but there is that technical mindset. What are the processes involved? So if I'm doing stuff with art and giving an example of an attack in configuration, so this is unrelated to the previous thing where I was talking about evading a ban by changing your MAC address by spoofing that. This is unrelated to that. That line of thought is closed. We're talking about a general attack involving ARP poisoning, rather. So if I'm pretty sure that a man-in-the-middle attack does this as well, of changing it does, where you can shift around what devices think the IP of a router is on a network, so that an innocent person's computer thinks that they're connecting to the router, but they're actually connecting to the hacker's computer. The router would think that they're connecting with a legitimate person, but it's the hacker's computer, and the router doesn't know that the hacker is broadcasting his own computer as if it's the router to the other computers that are going to be targeted from this man-in-the-middle attack, because then all the information is going through the hacker's computer. The key thing here, so like it's an important soft technical skill to understand what are the relevant details that you need to pay attention to in a situation like this. Well, you're changing associations between IP and MAC addresses because you're changing what devices that are trying to log onto think the router is, and you're changing what the router thinks you are. The ARP table for that network is going to be manipulated. So a countermeasure to that is having statically addressed tables. So everything has just one IP address associated to it. All MAC addresses have just one IP address set to it so that it can't be changed. So that's one way to fool that attack, to mitigate that attack, to make it not possible to be done. I hope that was more specific reference, because the vague concept is having this process of understanding that there are patterns of how a program interacts or how different devices interact on a network. Looking at what configurations can I apply to change the bad behavior where there's a vulnerability and stop that from happening in the case of doing a defensive configuration, where that is very much in the same general vein as hacking a modded video game. You see a certain behavior, like, I want to change that. This is why doing hacking labs is really important, because then you're able to get that feedback and see what's working and how it's working. And I think it's absurd where there's kind of this fantastical mindset of, people would test their chops by trying to hack into the Pentagon or something stupid like that. Anyone that gets good, if you want to get good, then you would have your own home lab set up where you have something like Metasploit set up on a computer where it's a purposefully vulnerable machine so that you can test out different ways of connecting to it and hacking into it to test your chops. You need to understand feedback in order to understand what effect you had, and it's only after you are at a very high level that you know what to expect, and you don't have to go, well, is this going to work? Is this not? What's going to happen here? Because you know it. But in order to get to that level, you have to see it happen a whole bunch of times. The cool badass action hero who presses the button and then the car explodes behind him and he doesn't look at the explosion. He's looked at enough explosions. He's done the whole, boom, there goes the world thing, where he doesn't have to look at it. That shows a sense of experience, and that's visual storytelling there. But that goes to demonstrate a sense of familiarity. When you're at a certain level, you can play by feel. You don't have to have as much feedback to understand what you're doing because you're familiar enough with what should be happening. It's kind of like a guitar player. That's a better example. If you are starting out as a complete newbie, you're going to be looking at the strings a whole lot and trying to figure out, okay, how do I put my hand on this fret, or I have it here? You'll develop the muscle memory over time where you can play a guitar blindfolded. Actually, Little V Mills, not sponsored or whatever, he has a couple of videos where he does some guitar work while blindfolded. I think for the Near Automata covers that he does. He's wearing a blindfold while doing that, and he doesn't need to see the guitar. Really good guitarists, they don't have to expend so much brain power on shredding because they have the muscle memory, they have the experience to shred really well. And so that's what I'm trying to develop is shredding skills to shred through code. Oh, yeah. I'm trying to develop skills where I have that sense of familiarity by really diving into cybersecurity. And I think the mindset and the discipline of getting over the learning curve when it comes to Blender and when it comes to modding video games, of going, yeah, this is really overwhelming at the start, but I stuck with it and I was able to, change things. Where since I was able to overcome that, I now have a lot of confidence in myself that, yeah, I'll be able to do this much more practical thing when it comes to actual security skills and actually managing, a defensive environment. So I'm very much looking forward to growing my skills when it comes to cybersecurity, and I hope to share more of those experiences with you in the future. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you in the next recording. Goodbye.